this week is the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. And as you remember, the murder of George Floyd by police officer Chauvin just sent ripples of protest all across the world. And so we're going to give you some clips of what we see as a result of 1 year later. What do we expect Congress to do? What do we expect the United States Senate to do? We want you to pass the George Floyd Act. We want to change the way we train, the way we allow police to respond, and we want to change the way police are held accountable for the acts that they perform that are inappropriate, unfair, unjust, and just without any regard to life and safety of people. And so we're going to talk about that.
Justice for one is justice for all. On behalf of the over 66,000 mostly African-American lawyers in this country and globally, we must support the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We don't have a choice. Unless we want to see the carnage that we've seen happen over and over and over again, and that's not acceptable. So please call your senator, impress upon everybody in your community that we've got to do this.
As we stand here today, we have some data that we've been told that in the first 4 months of this year, there were only 6 days where there were no police shootings in America since George Floyd's untimely death. And so we don't understand how it is the United States Senate is having trouble passing the George Floyd Act. What we are suggesting is that our citizens across this country, we are going to be mobilizing pastors, part of our 1,000 churches connected, to contact their United States senators, wherever they are, from Kentucky, New York, all across the 11 southern states where they seem to bleed red. We want them to turn blue and turn on to pushing their United States senators to focus on supporting the George Floyd Act as it is, without compromise. We are not going to continue to compromise the lives of African American men in this country at the hands of rogue police officers. There must be police accountability. And so we're pushing for a level of accountability for those officers who continuously violate the system, violate the rules, and decide to mete out justice on the streets of America. We are calling on all of our constituents in New York and Atlanta and in Michigan and in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Texas. All of our satellite offices will be on the ready to contact the United States senators. It's 2 from every state. We want to contact every one of the senators, urging them to move past their racism and vote for the George Floyd Act. And so
the pain and stain of racism and police brutality runs right through the heart of Chicago, from Emmett Till to Fred Hampton to Laquan McDonald, Philip Coleman, who was a staff member here at Rainbow Push, Rekia Boyd, Stephon Watts. These are names that we are all too familiar with when it comes to the misconduct and misbehavior of police officers. We demand today, in spite of not meeting the president's timeline of this bill being signed and in front of him for approval, we believe the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act must be passed without compromise. This bill contains what we need. We know by experience the work and legacy of Reverend Jesse Jackson, nearly 55 years. We know that court rulings do not change public policy, legislation does. And from social justice to civil rights, this act moves us forward. moves us forward in several ways. One is accountability. Two is transparency. Three is reform. And what is a real hallmark is our uncompromised spirit as it relates to qualified immunity. We believe that police officers like Derek Chauvin ought to be and must be convicted and must be held accountable, not just in the criminal justice system, but there must be civil penalties leveled against them and police officers and police departments. And so without compromise, we want this bill passed, and we want it passed now. We're calling all of our affiliates and all of our satellites around the country, as civil rights organizations are joining together in a moment of moral consciousness at 6 p.m. across the country, to take 9 minutes and 29 seconds to remember the life of George Floyd, but to rise to the call of moral responsibility and accountability. We want this bill passed. We want it passed without compromise. We've seen legislation move through the House and the Senate in an accelerated fashion when it comes to giving billions to corporations, when it comes to bill and legislations for other groups. We waited long enough, we've suffered long enough, we've marched long enough, and now's the time for the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. A legislator who needs no introduction, who has worked tirelessly around the country representing Chicago and the interests of black and brown people everywhere, Congressman Danny Davis.
Well, thank you very much, and I am delighted to stand here between two outstanding faith leaders, Reverend Dr. Janette Wilson and Bishop Tavis Grant, who in the same spirit that Dr. Martin Luther King, the same spirit that Jesse Jackson, whom I often say has done more to advance the causes of poor black and brown people than any other person I know that is still alive. And so I'm pleased to be here, standing on the steps of PUSH. You know, it's amazing that no matter how much things change, how they remain in many ways the same. The murder of our brother has been transformative. Transformative. People responded to the killing of Floyd George, not only all over America, but all over the world. And yet, we have recalcitrant law enforcement officials who are doing the very same things that the officers in Minneapolis did. Notwithstanding the spotlight, notwithstanding the news coverage, notwithstanding what people have learned and what we know, they are every week, every time you pick up the paper, you see where law enforcement personnel, police officers for the most part, have killed some other unarmed person with every kind of excuse that you can imagine as the rationale for it happened. Fortunately, in the House of Representatives, we have passed what can be a tremendous amount of change in terms of how law enforcement conducts its business and activities. And yet, over in the Senate, there seem to be a group of individuals who are answering to the call of something we don't know what they're answering to. They're not even answering to their constituents. They're not answering to individuals who describe themselves as being Republicans or conservatives. They are answering to some unknown call that says you cannot force law enforcement to come into the world of reality knowing that it must change the way it conducts its business. So we renew the call for the Senate to come into the 21st century, to come into the year 2021, to come into the year that says this is when the change actually comes. So if you've got a senator, or if you live in a state where you think you got a senator, if you live in a state where you ought to have a senator, call them up and let them know that the time is absolutely now. We must pass in the Senate the George Floyd Policing Act, and the president is waiting. I don't know if he's got a silver tip pen or if he's got a pencil, but he's waiting to sign this legislation. All the Senate has to do is get it to him. So thank you all for being a part and covering this commemoration, this commemorative effort.
Hi, I'm Todd Yeary here outside Dr. King's workshop, the Rainbow Push headquarters, where people of goodwill from all walks and all places gather as comrades in the movement for justice and equality. Social justice movements have been birthed in the imaginations of people in places just like this. You can be a part of this justice movement too. Join Rainbow Push as we fight for justice in the 21st century. Go to rainbowpush.org or dial 773-FREEDOM and remember, keep hope alive.
I can't breathe.
George Floyd's death went around the world in less than an hour.
I looked at that and I kept saying to myself, I can't believe this. I can't believe this.
When I say George, you say Floyd. George Floyd!
You see him begging to live. Begging to live. Let me breathe.
The civil rights leaders who fought for racial justice with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. more than 50 years ago are shocked that some of the same issues they marched and bled for are being relitigated today. Voting rights, health care, police brutality.
There's so many broken promises, so many unfinished pieces. We haven't repaired and eliminated bigotry. It's still with us.
He is the image of this generation.
Till was the 14-year-old boy who was lynched in Mississippi in 1955. His killers acquitted by an all-white jury.
That's correct. He's standing correct.
But the video and conviction of Floyd's killer, police officer Derek Chauvin, makes this moment in history dramatically different than the overwhelming number of police brutality cases against black people. Floyd's killing pierced through a global pandemic, perhaps igniting the largest mass movement in U.S. history.
Black lives matter. They're really saying that people matter. That black life must not be cheapened by killing without consequences.
I can't breathe. It's become now almost the language of the streets.
I compare it to the little girl in Vietnam who was walking down the road naked because the napalm had bombed the clothes off of her. George Floyd's death had that kind of disgusting impact on people of goodwill who said, no, this is too much.
For the surviving members of Dr. King's inner circle, there are lessons today's activists can learn from their experiences and the experiences of leaders that were lost in 2020. Reverend C.T. Vivian and Congressman John Lewis. For former UN Ambassador Andrew Young, one of King's most trusted advisors, dedication to the greater cause is key.
We just decided that freedom and justice and opportunity and to perfect this democracy was really worth your life. And he said, we probably won't make it to 40. He said, but if we make it past 40, we're going to have to make it to 100 because it's going to take a long time to straighten this place out.
For media pioneer Zernona Clayton, Dr. King's confidant, activists must protect the movement.
Dr. King never did anything without a plan. Keep your environment pure and clear of interlopers, people who just want an opportunity to get in on the news-making moments.
For Reverend Jesse Jackson, King's protege, hope is powerful.
What do you take away from your experience with your close relationship to Dr. King?
Keep your faith, love matters. There must be a way out of the crisis. I miss him very much.
But the most important common lesson, uphold nonviolent resistance. For Young, it was the moment he and fellow marchers kneeled before dogs and police in Birmingham to show the power of nonviolence.
Instead of marching up to the dogs and yelling at them, people got down on their knees and they started praying. The dogs were calmed down by the people praying, and the policemen were telling the firemen to turn on the fire hoses, and they too were moved and they let the fire hoses drop. That was one of the amazing things about the civil rights movement. Nobody gave a damn about death. In fact, Dr. King used to preach our funerals, and he made us laugh at our own possibility of death.
Laughter in the face of death and enjoying the journey. The three all recall King's final birthday, trying to help him break through some of the depression they all felt.
We're going to celebrate Martin Luther King's Day today.
It was Jesse and Andy. They said, Sir Nona is the one who could change this.
Knowing what's coming up for you, we thought you'd be strung out on a shoestring, so when you go to jail, here's some shoestring potatoes.
They knew that through the pain and struggle, you must also find the joy. It was his last birthday at 39.
Martin Luther King is more with us now than he was in 1967. I would say to these young people that we're not going to ever be able to get George Floyd out of our systems, as we will never forget Martin Luther King or John Lewis, and we should.
Suzanne Malveaux, CNN.